Well, when I was in third grade, I did something terrible. I was in Mrs. Mays' class most of the day, but for science, our class switched classrooms with Mrs. Ashkenazy's class, who did our science lesson. And one day, while I was sitting in Mrs. Ashkenazy's class watching another boring science experiment, I looked down in the desk that I was sitting in. It was Penny Burleson's desk. And I always sat there for science class. This time, though, I saw something I hadn't seen before. I saw a new pencil box. I reached down and flipped open the lid of the pencil box and was not surprised by what I saw. What did I see? Pencils. And erasers. The erasers caught my eye. They weren't the boring pink angular erasers that my mom always bought me for school. Penny's mom had bought her these big, cool, colorful erasers with pictures and characters stamped on them. And I remember how bright the colors were, how new they looked, how new they smelled. I remembered the feel of them in my hands, so I took them. And I put them in my pocket. Now, a day or two later, my teacher, Mrs. Mays, pulled me out of class. She said that Penny Burleson couldn't find her erasers, and she wanted to know if I took them. Now, in retrospect, it seems like Mrs. Mays was making an awful lot of unwarranted assumptions about my involvement in this alleged crime, and that in their bloodlust desire to punish someone, I was being accused with circumstantial evidence at best. But none of that mattered, because I had the erasers in my pocket and I handed them over. Mrs. Mays frowned at me and said we were going to have to talk about this later, which we did. That night when I got home, my mother told me that Mrs. Mays had called her and told her about my thievery. So she also said that Mrs. Mays and Mrs. Ashkenazy wanted to have a meeting the next day. So the next day, they grilled me about the crime, why I took the erasers, how I took the erasers, who I was working with in taking the erasers. I remember one part of the meeting very distinctly, though. Mrs. Mays told me that I was being considered for the third grade gifted program, which was quite an honor. Jeff Niehaus was in the third grade gifted program, and I always wanted to be smart like Jeff Niehaus. But maybe, Mrs. Mays said, they needed to reconsider letting me into the program, given my criminal record. I walked around for several days in a state of shame and guilt. The next time I went into Mrs. Ashkenazy's room for science, I could tell as I walked in the classroom, she was staring right at me as I walked in. And after sitting down and looking down in Penny Burleson's desk and seeing the pencil box, which was right there, I remember looking up from my desk and my eyes locked with Mrs. Ashkenazy's, and she did this. As she was staring at me, she did this. As if to say, don't even think about it. And defeated and chastened, I nodded affirmatively, dropped my head, and I've never, ever stealed another eraser, ever, ever. In fact, every time I pick up an eraser, I can see Mrs. Ashkenazy in my head. We all have childhood stealing stories. Moments when we couldn't resist the temptation to take something that wasn't ours. My wife, Michelle, told me that one time at a grocery store with her mother, she took a piece of candy from the candy bin. Anybody ever done that? While driving home, she actually took it out to eat. This was just bad planning on her part. Her mother saw it and asked where she got it, and from the store, Michelle answered. Also, poor execution. That stealing, lectured her mother, so Michelle's mother drove back to the store, marched her back in, made her return the candy to the manager with her apologies. We all have an early memory of stealing. Anybody here have an early memory of stealing something that didn't belong to you? Drew, what'd you steal? Shoelaces. Aim high, man. You're preschool, that's true. You do need shoelaces. Chuck, what'd you steal? A roll of cord. That's like $50, right? $10. Did you get caught? Really? What'd you have to do? It's a good plan. Anybody over here, what'd you steal? Who stole something as a child? Jason, I know you lived a life of crime. What did you get? What'd you steal? Like tiny little marbles? Well, those are there for you to take, right? I mean, it's being kind to the neighborhood children. These are the moments when we learn definitively, hopefully, that stealing is wrong. That's the 8th commandment, right? That's the 8th commandment, right? Do not steal. We learned it as kids. Don't steal erasers. Don't steal candy. Don't steal marbles. Don't steal quarters. Don't steal shoelaces. It seems like a simple, easy lesson. Don't take stuff that doesn't belong to you. If only it were that simple, though, and if only it were that easy. But as we're going to find out this morning, the 8th commandment is neither as simple or as easy as it looks. And as much as we think we've learned this lesson, we haven't. Which is why we're talking about it this morning. For those of you who are just joining us, we're in week 8 of our current series here at Rooftop. It's called God's Big 10. And it's a study on the 10 words of instruction that God gave to the Israelites following their liberation from the slavery of Egypt. These were the 10 laws by which Israel was going to be made distinct as a nation. These laws were going to separate them from the rest of the world and also show the world how life goes better under the rule of Yahweh, Israel's God. Now, some of these rules and some of these laws that we've talked about during this series have been tricky. And they've given us plenty to talk about. They're not all black and white. What exactly does it mean, for example, to keep the Sabbath? It's kind of hard. What exactly does it mean, for example, to honor your mother and father? I mean, that's kind of ambiguous. What exactly does it mean to not kill somebody? These are surprisingly complicated commands. The 8th commandment, though, seems simple. You shall not steal. Don't take stuff that isn't yours. Simple, easy. And the commandment is based on the idea that we are material beings. God created us material beings. We need goods and stuff to live and be happy. We don't need as many as we think, but we still need goods and stuff to be happy. We have a right to own and have this stuff. And the 8th commandment gives us permission to own property. We're not communists who aren't allowed to own anything. We can own our stuff. God set it up this way. But there's a right way to get stuff and a wrong way to get stuff. The right way is through hard work and saving and building. The wrong way is through taking it from others, which is what theft is. The Hebrew word for steal means to carry something away as if by stealth. So simple enough, do not steal. And most of us obey that law, at least most of us think we do. In fact, according to a study done many years ago by George Barna, 90% of Christians say they never steal. Now maybe that's true, but I doubt it. Once again, we run into the low bar problem here. Remember the low bar problem. We've talked about it a few times over the course of this series. The problem of the low bar is that we take God's commands and we interpret them in such a low way that we think we're obeying the command so that we can call ourselves religious. We set the bar really low. How do we do this with the 8th commandment? Well, we do it in our minds. We think about stealing as a malicious act of ripping off another person, Bernie Madoff style, or robbing banks. That's how we view stealing. But if stealing is the act of taking something from somebody else that doesn't belong to you, then we have to reconsider where this bar really is. For example, here's a few questions. Have we ever skimped on our taxes? Have we paid every single penny we owe to the government? Have we ever made income and not reported it? Do I report every wedding or funeral payment I get? Did I ask that question out loud? Do I have to answer it out loud? This is against the law. The government, God's, Jesus says it. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Or secondly, have we ever downloaded music or videos or software we didn't pay for? We don't own those songs. We didn't buy them from the people who do, depriving them and their employees of income they need to live. 4 years ago, for example, I got a new iPod as a gift. And I didn't have that much music to upload to my new iPod, and I didn't want to buy any of the expensive iTunes songs available on the website. So I came up with what I thought was a great idea. I'd go borrow CDs from the public library and load them onto my iPod. And for several weeks, I would travel from library to library, doing research on the St. Louis County Library website, finding albums I wanted to have, then driving to go pick them up, loading them on my iPod. I probably loaded up between 30 to 50 CDs and several hundred songs. Then it occurred to me one day, this might not be legal. So I researched it and found it is very illegal. But I also found people saying stuff like, yeah, it's illegal, but it's not that big of a deal, and you probably won't get caught. Not exactly how I want to live my life. So with tears in my eyes, I went into my account and deleted every single library song I had uploaded. Gordon Lightfoot, Michael Bolton, Phantom of the Opera, all gone. Here's another question. Have we ever misused company benefits? Have we ever taken office supplies for personal use? Have we ever gotten reimbursed for expenses that aren't really expenses? Or also, have we ever wasted our employer's time? A survey from a few years ago reported that an average employee wastes over, you might want to guess, 2 hours per day, costing billions of dollars. That means the employer is paying more money to more people to produce the same product. And the cost of this added labor get passed on to consumers, the people sitting around us, many of whom don't have much spare change. Economists point out that 1/3 of a product's cost comes as they have a word for this, theft surcharge, to account for the time wasted and the products and materials stolen along the way of getting a product to market. So it's easy to rationalize sticking it to the man, they're not going to miss it, until we realize that all we really do is sticking it to each other. So finally, here's a more aggressive question. Have we ever skimped God? Have we ever given God less than what he asks for in either our time or our money? The Bible has an unfortunate word for this. The Bible calls it robbery. Given that God gives us everything we have and has the right to ask us for whatever he wants. The prophet Malachi writes this, "Will man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. In your tithes and contributions, you are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you." Now this gets kind of complicated because we don't like talking about giving our time and money to God as an obligation. And besides which, how much do we owe God? 10%? 20%? But I think I'm on safe ground to say none of us have given back to God all that he asks for. And the Bible calls that robbery, given that everything we have is God's, and he wants it back. So in more ways than one, we're all thieves. We might not rob banks or investors of their retirement. We just rob the government, each other, and God. It's why Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer, he put it this way. If we look at mankind in all its conditions, it is nothing but a vast, wide stable full of thieves.